Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jess Lenore. The Trump administration is ratcheting up its fight with California over environmental protections. On Thursday, it accused the state of failing to protect its water supply from pollutants like runoffs from homeless encampments. Just days earlier, the administration threatened some $19 billion in federal highway funding for the state failing to meet its obligations under the Clean Air Act. But California says Trump's recent attacks are retaliation for the state opposing White House efforts to gut environmental protections. Here to talk about this and more, Steve Horn, a reporter for the Real News Network's Climate Crisis Bureau. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, on one hand, California does face huge environmental problems, but on the other hand, the Trump administration is taking historic steps to roll back these same regulations around the country, and it seems like that might be at the root of some of these issues. And also, Trump is deeply unpopular in California, and he's sort of playing to his base by, similar to what he did in Baltimore, citing a democratically controlled area and just seems like calling out everything that's wrong with it, and not, of course, trying to hold himself accountable for the role he played in this problem. What are your thoughts?
I guess it's a two-step thing. So step one is there's actually a lot of truth behind what the Trump administration said. For example, according to this year's most recent American Lung Association data, 6 of the top 10 cities for ozone pollution are in California, including San Diego, where I live. Number one in the country is Los Angeles, which is infamous for its air quality. So, of course, there's truth in that. But then, of course, there's also the extreme hypocrisy of pushing forward this kind of maneuver when at the same time, it's cars on the road in California and on highways and traffic jams that are causing extreme ozone pollution. And it gets back to something that happened earlier this year, which is one of Trump's first attacks, at least in California, in the Newsom era. And that was when the Trump administration decided to pull $1 billion in funding that was federal funding that was guaranteed to go towards California's push to create a high-speed rail line that would go from the northern part of the state to the southern part of the state. So all those dynamics are happening at the same
time. And so talk about how environmentalists have reacted to this news, and are they going to use this as an opportunity to, put forth issues around public transportation, which, you just referenced. Is that going to, if the feds aren't going to fund it, can the state do more to increase investment?
Well, the problem is kind of it just takes so much money to actually build out mass transit. So any solution on mass transit, especially in urban, kind of interurban mass transit, as opposed to these statewide initiatives, was actually both. It's going to require a lot of federal funding. And so it gets to your question, are environmentalists or are transit advocates kind of saying, hey, maybe there's actually kind of a diamond in the rough here, that this is a pretty crazy situation going on, but is there some kind of positive solution that we can take from these dynamics? And I've seen within, especially the transit orbit on like transit blogs or transit news websites, that some are saying, well, hey, look, it's pretty insane that at the federal level that our highways are actually funded by taxes, gasoline taxes, or money that comes out of buying gasoline. So actually it's fossil fuel consumption that builds more of these highways, which perpetuates on itself. So some have said, well, maybe we can use this opportunity to, like what you said, push for more high-speed transit. I think it's too early. It's a few days after the Trump administration, a couple of days after the Trump administration announced that it might pull this funding. So it's kind of too soon to say whether or not that can take place. But it still gets back to the first part, that for the state's landmark high-speed rail project, the Trump administration pulled $1 billion in funding earlier this year. And now that's the subject of an ongoing lawsuit between the state of California and the Trump administration, which gets to the root cause of everything that we're talking about, is that it is these several dozens, maybe at this point, of lawsuits that the state of California has filed against the Trump administration for its environmental deregulation agenda that underpins everything that we're talking about.
So what I found pretty interesting is that this is not the first time the Trump administration has actually cited the weakness of climate policy as a mean to discredit critiques of its actions. Another example is what former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt did as it relates to pulling out of the Paris climate deal. Here's a clip.
You may not know this, but Paris, it set targets of 26 to 28%. With the entire agenda of the previous administration, we still fell 40% short of those targets. It was a failed deal to begin with. And even if all of the targets were met by all nations across the globe, it only reduced the temperature by less than 1 degree.
So what do you make of the Trump administration citing such examples when pushing its agenda? And what does this mean for climate policy going forward?
Well, to me, I think it points to the fact that when, we'll say the liberal wing, as opposed to like the more radical wing of the climate movement, when it pushes forward kind of half-baked solutions, they're subject to attacks like these, and they're subject to it being pointed out by right-wing people like Scott Pruitt, people like Andrew Wheeler, Donald Trump. They're subject to them saying, well, your solutions aren't actually doing much to solve the issue anyway, and here's why it's bad, and here's why we're going to keep doing what we're doing. So I think that it should be alarming in that, these people have an electoral base, and these things can be pointed to as examples of why these policies are quote unquote failures. I think it should be a wake-up call that they're using the rhetoric in this way to point out the failures of the policy. And it should be sort of a springboard to say, we need to do more. There needs to be, why is California's air the dirtiest in the country? It has to do with the fact that there's so many cars on the road. There's been a failure over the past decades to build out more transit in its cities and from one urban area to another. And it's a failure of housing policy in that there's not affordable housing close to where people work, so they go and live pretty far from where the workplace is and clog up the highways in that way, given the lack of transit. So there's a whole number of factors, but I think the fact that they can attack from almost like somewhat of a left perspective on these things is damning. I think it's a damning statement about the failure of the policy agenda that exists right now on climate change in this country.
All right, Steve Horn, thank you for shedding light on this, continuing sort of fight between California and, I guess, California, the Trump administration, and actually like the residents of California that have to deal with the consequences of all of these actions and all this policy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.